for those of y'all that live in the Bay Area, possibly California, maybe even watch certain news outlets, you might have heard about a couple weeks ago. There was a major wave of blackouts that left 130,000 homes and businesses without power in San Francisco. That basically meant a third of the city was without power, uh, and one of the busiest shopping days of the year. So this was caused by a fire at the Mission substation in the Mission district in San Francisco. And unsurprisingly, when employees went down there to look at the issue, they found out that there are a lot of other problems with the substation. And while they were fixing it, it caused blackouts to spread even further from the Richmond and Sunset districts to a lot of different parts of the city. So power would remain out for thousands of people, some of whom didn't get electricity until Tuesday morning. I know one person personally didn't get her power back on until like 4 a.m., which is absolutely ridiculous, completely unacceptable. And so, it caused lots of businesses to lose thousands of dollars in revenue during one of the busiest shopping days of the year, as I mentioned earlier. One of the most notable things was that Waymos shut down, blocking each other, causing major traffic jams in many different intersections. This is a moment that, went viral and made a lot of people start to question, like, are Waymos really such a good idea? Is it such a good idea that we're cutting Muni to, promote this private alternative that can't even work if there's a lack of power? Doesn't seem like it to me. But I think most importantly, though, it left a lot of people in their homes without power, causing them to lose refrigerated foods, and in some dire situations, important things like medication. There was one really important piece that was put out by Mission Local that talked about how there were some elderly folks that were basically isolated, and if it wasn't for their neighbors and other people in their community who knew they needed to check up on them, they could have ended up in an even worse situation. And so, the issue did mostly end up being resolved for a lot of people the next day. But it's important to note that the quote unquote fix that the privately owned utilities company implemented involved running generators 24/7 until they eventually reconnected people back onto the grid over a week later, early or late at night. So all this happened, with this in the span of a couple days. But it's also important to note that there was another substation fire, which I mentioned in last week's news update, in the South Bay on Christmas Eve, which affected thousands of people. There were intense storms across the state that really tested the limits of the electrical infrastructure that PG&E has set up. And it left many people without power all throughout the state, not just in Northern California. So in reality, this is just a notch in PG&E's belt, given more than the past decade's track record that they have. The major pipeline explosion in San Bruno, the deadly fires that have destroyed almost 1 million acres of land. They've filed for multiple bankruptcies. They've consistently preferred to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and lawsuits rather than fix the problems they've been caught red-handed and neglecting. And this is their track record for over 30 years. Every time they get caught doing something that they're not supposed to, even when they have to pay the fine, even when they're supposed to be held accountable and fix these issues, they just pay the fine and move on. And why is that? Well, a lot of people, this is kind of music to their ears, but it comes down to just the neoliberalization of these basic public utilities. The privatization of stuff like electricity and gas and other things, when in reality, even in other parts of the state, other counties focus more on public utilities, which is a thing that a lot of folks take for granted. When this ends up happening, it not only lowers the quality of these public services, but it just allows them to become less accountable over time. At least if there's a publicly run utility or aspect of a social safety net, that you can hold somebody accountable for that. If it's a corporation, realistically, like, the only people that's going to take corporation to task are the people. But yeah, so a lot of mess going on these past couple weeks. But I'd be curious to hear just some of your thoughts about all of this, Dayton, and what do you think? What do you make of all this?
Well, my first question is, so PG&E's been in charge of SS Power for what, 30 years, you say?
Yeah, I think there was one thing I was looking up. It's like in 2003 they got caught for not having fixed stuff that they had previously been caught doing in 1996. So it's been happening for a long time now.
But before then, there was the public utility, and it was replaced by PG&E.
Yeah, I believe so.
Well, I think it's like the neoliberal playbook, right? It's that problems with the public service are sort of inflated to the point that they justify replacing with a private service. And then when quality still declines because it's a private service, people are just left, ass up, without a paddle, so to speak. I think it's interesting because I think, from my understanding with that San Bruno fire, I think multiple PG executives had to plead guilty to manslaughter charges because the people
Oh
who were
yeah,
killed in the fires.
there was
Right?
like a bunch of people that got killed. There was probably around 60 people that got injured.
Yeah, but I think think of how ridiculous that is, right? You're part of a major corporation. That major corporation has some, responsibility to the public. You neglect that responsibility, you get people killed, then you just plead guilty to manslaughter, you pay a fine, and you stay in your job.
Pretty
Right?
much.
Like, it's crazy, right? Like, imagine if a muni bus driver runs over a bunch of school kids. Can he just pay a fine and, go
No.
back to work the next day? Doesn't make any
The
sense. So it's
union's
like
not going
rules.
to protect that shit.
Yeah, so it's like rules for thee, but not for me, which is the main issue, right?
Yep.
There's also a time with all these problems with these Waymos going around, right? The Waymos couldn't connect without power. Rather, they couldn't get their Wi-Fi connection. They couldn't use their GPS, so they're just didn't know how to deal with all the flashing red lights,
Or
And
lack of lights altogether, because some of them run on the actual traffic lights.
yeah, and so you think of Mayor Lori talking about how they want to cut these muni funds to bolster Waymos. So it's like this whole this privatization disaster just repeating itself, right? Like then we're gonna further make more cuts to public transportation to make more subsidies for private corporations that are going to be even less prepared and less willing to deal with catastrophes like these power outages, right? And so obviously we could just say that the solution to this is just like a public utility for all. But I think there's always that good counter argument that even then the public utility isn't always often as good. So I think it goes back to the idea that, again, we as the people have to be engaged in these things. We can't just leave them off to experts or bureaucrats.
Yeah.
They're going to solve these problems. Because in this society, they just replace it with private companies. There's a thing that everyone's dealing with, right? You have the privatization of healthcare, the monopolization of housing, the big credit bubbles that are going on. What I always think is interesting is just the whole Lori administration, it's just been the whole intensification of propaganda, right? This whole approach has really been leaning into this sort of peace and law approach, right? Whereas the city's been so awful, but we're cleaning it up using technology and this new gung ho SF attitude. But really, it's just all just the more of the same, right? It's more of the same. While the big tech elites, since they control the big media, they control the media focus on this, right? And so instead of talking about the inadequacy of this private stuff, they just really they're continuing to push the narrative that what we need is actually more privatization, more tech and industry, more subsidies for private companies to take over the public utilities. So it's why important that we're all just talking about this issue. We can't just let these people literally keep getting away with murder.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that Lurie did say in the aftermath of this is oh, well, San Franciscans can't foot the bill for all of this. And it's yeah, but he's still not really making a push for a public utility company.
Yeah, because San Francisco's are footing the bill for all of this,
yeah,
right?
pretty much. And I think it's already somewhat of a talking point for a lot of people running for the governor's office, for Nancy Pelosi's seats, this and that. And there's a couple ways this can go. I think there's a lot of people out there who it's we don't like this private company, but what if we have our own private company? This idea of we're gonna have local autonomy over this, and instead of going to I don't know, it's called Clean Power SF or whatever. It's what if all these tech bros come up with their own solution, as if any of their other solutions to things actually solve anything and don't cause more problems. And yeah, I think that's also a really important point that you're bringing up is like, there is a chance that, there could be a really big push for this to all fully go back into the hands of, the government. But that's not the end of it. There's still a lot of stuff that needs to be done. It's not as simple as just like passing off the reins from one to another. It's like like I said, there was the 2010 San Bruno pipeline explosion. A few years ago, there was the dim sum place on Geary Street in San Francisco, which burned down because construction workers hit a pipeline and they literally had to dig up an alternative because they couldn't reach the emergency shutoff valve. Even a couple months ago, there was like a building in like, I want to say Hayward or something that blew up. And these are all, situations that they should have fixed over a decade ago. And it just by passing it off to the state, then it suddenly becomes a state problem. And all these people who got rich off of gouging us for our electrical bills are still rich and aren't held accountable. So I think, there's more to be done. But at the same time, yeah, I agree. The fact that it's making its way more into the conversation around this stuff is definitely a positive development.
Yeah, but again, there has to be like some kind of action, right? Because it's just so in vogue to talk about how terrible everything is, right? It's just so in vogue. What are we actually trying to do differently, Because I think, obviously, like, it's just like, because like what you're saying before, like we're not just saying that then we have to like then go with the ultra tech solution. It's like, oh, you're right, PG&E is awful. So what if we create a new San Francisco tech PG&E company? No, right. Absolutely not, right? And then everyone can say all the different problems with the pre-existing public utility companies, but like we need an actual socialist utility company, right? One that's actually accountable to the people, not the bureaucrats. But that's like a larger issue, right?
It's not just sewer socialism in Milwaukee or whatever.
Yeah, ridiculous. Yeah, sewer socialism. Pretty. I like that term. It's nice.
It was a thing. It's like it was a thing back in the day in the early 20th century where a lot of politicians in Milwaukee ran on a socialist platforms on this idea of like public utilities, public infrastructure. But that is also within the confines of, the system that exists already. And I think the reality of it is like there's always going to be limitations to this stuff, especially when we live in like the center of empire. We're never going to have a lot of the basic things that we see countries in Europe or even like some other countries that Americans don't like for one reason or another have, and yeah, it's because like it's a necessary element to maintain what's happening.